Hey folks, it's Dr. K from Today with Dr. K on WEAA, and we're here with the first part of a special 4-part series getting us ready for the upcoming election. We know that there is a lot of noise to cut through right now. We're getting it from all sides. It's coming down to the important issues that are at stake in this election, and maybe you're not clear on what we should be focused on. Today, we're going to help you start to cut through the noise. Between now and Election Day, I'll be joined by Kirsten West Savali, VP of Content at Urban One's iOne Digital and former executive producer of News and Politics editor for Essence Magazine. Good morning, Kirsten.
Good morning, Kay. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm also joined by Tim Wise, author and senior fellow at the African American Policy Forum and no stranger to our airways. Welcome back, Tim.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. K.
Our hope is to add some nuance to mainstream media coverage and, of course, to hear from you. So we're going to meet and talk through some of the most important elements that we think are going unheard. So go online to the African American Policy Forum, go to our website, join the conversation with us on social media, write to us, give us a call. We want to know your thoughts. So let's get into the discussion because there's so much to think about. At this point, we've got polls coming in from all directions, and I want to be very clear. We know we take polls with a grain of salt because we have to be clear that polls don't tell the whole story because, Tim, if they did, then Hillary Clinton would have been president if polls told the whole story, and they do not. We know we're not clear on what's happening in the swing states. We're trying to understand the undecided voters, and we might finally get them to come to some type of conclusion. Given all of that and the avalanche of ads that voters are being subjected to, we know under normal situations, according to communication reports, we are exposed to no less than 3,000 ads per day during an election cycle that triples. So we're getting ads from everywhere. We want to talk about the issues that are likely to make a difference coming down to the wire. Is it the economy? Is it a threat to democracy that's being posed by Donald Trump and everyone who is supporting the Trumplican ideology? Is it reproductive justice and reproductive freedom? Is it about body autonomy for women? Is it concerns about immigration and the border? Just what do you expect the campaigns to do in this last final days as part of their closing arguments? And do you think these strategies, whatever they are, will be effective? So with that in mind, let me first come to you, Tim, to kind of outline for us some of the key essential elements that you think we need to focus on and to help us make sense of them.
You know, I think there are a lot of different issues that motivate voters, particularly from state to state. And I think they matter to different constituencies to different degrees. My concern right now is that the Harris campaign seems to sort of suddenly be playing it very safe, even as the post-debate bounce and the post-convention bounce that she and Tim Walz got have really faded. They seem to be right now content to have her out there repeating stories about growing up middle class, talking about her mom, knowing what it is to struggle, all of which is lovely, but unless she's contrasting that with Donald Trump, a man who has never known struggle at all, or contrasting it with Elon Musk, who is Donald Trump's biggest cheerleader, biggest booster, literally the richest man in the world, and draws a contrast that says, we're the ones who understand average everyday folks. These are people who only care about and represent the elite. Unless they do that, and I don't think they're doing enough of it, I'm not really sure what good the homespun homilies are. Second, they have to focus less on how many of these right-wing Republicans are endorsing them and more on the support of labor and working class folks, right? Enough with Liz Cheney. No one cares. The idea that these undecideds are mostly Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney Republicans who were looking for permission to vote against a fascist is just nonsense. In fact, I would say if you play up the endorsement of these establishment neocons, that increases the cynicism of progressives, the base of your party, and working people, because they know that Dick Cheney never did anything for them. Liz Cheney never did anything for them. Dick Cheney sent a bunch of those, working class folks' kids to war, right, on a lie. So it makes Harris seem like the candidate of the establishment rather than the guy who's actually running with the support of the richest man on the planet. And finally, they need to say something to make clear to those core Democratic voters the threats posed by Trump. And I know some people say, oh, don't worry about the base. They'll come in. We just need the swing voters. But there really aren't that many left at this point. And honestly, the ones who can't make up their minds, explain to me how you would ever understand what would motivate them. I mean, if you can sit there and listen to Donald Trump talk about Arnold Palmer's genitalia, and then you're still like, I don't know, maybe, then trying to figure out what you could say to those people is sort of a waste of time. But if you can drive the base turnout up, even just a few points, that can make a huge difference. That means drilling down on the threats to democracy, the threats to affordable health care, women's bodily autonomy. It means reminding voters that Trump wants to close the Department of Education. He wants to give police complete immunity for brutalizing people, including anyone who protests him exercising their First Amendment rights. It means that we need to remind people Donald Trump wants to pardon the folks who tried to violently overturn the last election and then throw people in jail who criticize him. So she's got to go big or she's going to go home. And all of this playing it safe stuff at this stage in the campaign is just not going to move the needle.
I want to just do one follow-up question before I bring Kirsten into the conversation about what you said about Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney. Because there is a sense that people feel, how can we trust what Harris is putting forward when more Republicans are coming to the table? And if they're coming to the table, what promises are being made? What's being exchanged behind the door? Because we know they're not coming for free. There's a cost for everything. And it feels like she's moving more to the right than to the left, the more Republicans who keep coming into the dinner table.
Right. I mean, it's great that they're coming there. Look, I am all about it. Anybody wants to come to the party, come to the party, but you don't get to tell the DJ what song they play. Okay. If you want to come and dance, you can dance to our tune. You can dance to our music. You don't get to come in and actually change the playlist. And my concern is your concern. That is there a quid pro quo? I'm not saying there is, and I don't, but you're right. Nothing is for free. So the idea that these folks are going to come in and endorse Kamala Harris if she's really committed to the kinds of progressive policy things that she has put forward. She's put forward several things. But are these folks then going to hamstring her from doing those things if she were to win? That's an understandable question. So I think this idea that you want to get those folks on board, Adam Kinzinger and all those folks, and Kinzinger is far different than Dick Cheney in that regard too. You want to get the never Trumpers on board. But I think we also got to remember, and I wish that the Harris campaign and the Democratic Party would, that part of the reason we're in the mess we're in right now is because of those people, right? These are not people whose hands are clean in the mess that we have in the creation of Donald Trump. These are people who engaged in campaigns that race baited for 20 years. These are people that created ads and created campaign strategies that did the same kind of fear-mongering that they now realize is wrong. So I'm glad that they've had their come to Jesus moment. But the problem is, at what point is Kamala Harris going to end up having to compromise with them on policy? I hope the answer is not at all. But the more we talk about them and the less we talk about labor unions that are behind, that are increasingly behind, or working people, I think that's a mess for the Democrats, and they need to be careful.
Kirsten, I want to bring you into the conversation kind of with a multi-layered question. One, to have you talk about exactly what has happened with the campaign of joy, because all we heard in the beginning was it's about joy. All we're doing is campaigning on that. And it feels like it's becoming a little lackluster. And I wonder, as my second question, if it's because in the midst of this campaign, we're not really focused on the ongoing genocide of Palestinian people, which I think is a really important issue that kind of is casting a shadow over what's happening.
Thank you for that framing, Kaye. And also thank you, Tim, for bringing up Liz Cheney, because every time I see her on stage, I'm like, why are we doing this? Why do we have Liz Cheney on this stage? It's very hard to have a campaign about joy in the middle of a genocide that we're seeing every single day. We are seeing children being blindfolded, hands behind their back, marched like they're in the Holocaust. We are seeing people being burned alive. Increasingly, data shows that the alarm is being sounded about Vice President Harris in swing states due to this genocide, right? The Biden administration called for a ceasefire many months ago, while still sending billions of military aid to Israel, with $3.8 billion promised to them each year through 2028, which is contingent upon Israel purchasing a percentage of U.S. military equipment. Like someone framed it a few weeks ago, it's basically a gift card to buy U.S. military equipment. The dismissal, kind of this rather lack of prioritizing Arab voters, Black Muslim voters, and other progressive voters in swing states. I know Tim says we need to shore up the base, and we absolutely do. But that can come back to haunt Democrats. I really, really believe that. HRC moved further right, too, and folks blamed the left, who said she wouldn't win when that happened. They blamed the left when we said Biden wasn't the candidate, and then these were the same people who pushed him out, who were first saying that, if we don't vote for him, then the collapse of democracy is kind of at our feet. So right now, there is not an insignificant number of Black and Gen Z voters paying attention. They're struggling to hold nuance and duality, to be strategic and reduce harm domestically while being able to sleep at night. There's a CBS poll, 61% of Americans are against sending aid to Israel. A September NBC poll found that 8% of Gen Z voters ranked ending Israel's violence in Gaza above climate change, immigration, racial justice, and gun policy. Recently VP Harris has moved to shore up and in some cases hopefully win back support in battlegrounds. So I'm probably most interested in seeing how those efforts, coupled with protests around the nation and the globe, impact the election at this point.
I want to do a follow-up to that because I'm thinking a lot about this other very important issue around reproductive freedom. I know here in Maryland, for example, question 1 on our ballot is about changing our Declaration of Rights, getting reproductive freedom enshrined into our state constitution, which is what Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said needs to happen. People need to do it on a state-by-state level. Can you talk about how that issue is kind of this looming issue that may be driving more white women in particular to support VP Harris? And are they continuing to sustain the support and the enthusiasm that they had in the beginning?
Well, I don't know, because reproductive justice was on the ballot with HRC too, and we saw 47% of white men break for Trump. So a thing, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, is a lot of people are blue and then they turn red when the lights go off. So I do think that we have women who are claiming to be invested, and I hope that is the case. Tarana Burke and the Me Too movement and other survivors recently put out a letter of saying they were against Donald Trump's campaign and why we should be against Donald Trump's campaign. We often talk in Black media spaces about reproductive justice not being around, safe, legal, destigmatized abortions, but also being about the right to raise our children in free and safe environments, which we don't get a chance to do when we have someone who is into militarized police forces, who is talking about our children being criminals, who is talking about quote-unquote shithole countries. So I do think reproductive justice is one of the main things that VP Harris has done well. She has been consistent about, but I hope that the lip service that women are giving to that issue is more than they gave when Hillary Clinton ran.
And now that we've framed out Donald Trump and VP Harris, Tim, I want to come back to you because I think the other piece that we have to add when we put Trump on the table, we've got to put JD Vance on the table because there's this idea that Trump might just be holding the spot so that the next person who's being crowned the king of the Republican Party, ready to step in if Trump doesn't make it 4 years, is JD Vance, who is very dangerous, kind of looming in the back because of his connections to Project 2025, because he is very intelligent and because he has charisma. Like he had people agreeing with him by the end of the debate, and he was lying all the way through. Can you talk a little bit about the JD Vance phenomena that we see being played out right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who is, 100% bought and paid for by the Peter Thiels of the world, by the Elon Musks of the world, by the tech bro, sort of cognitariat. And that ought to scare folks because you're talking about a group of people who don't feel accountable to anyone. Peter Thiel has said, for instance, that he has come to the conclusion, this is, one of the founders of PayPal, or what, a good friends with Elon, obviously very tight with JD Vance, financed in large measure JD Vance's Senate run. Peter Thiel has said that he's essentially concluded democracy is not workable. You can't have democracy and freedom, and he'd rather have freedom without democracy. This is a guy who wants to actually start communities on the open sea for rich people to be able to escape, the masses of the rest of us. And that's the guy who's the puppet master for JD Vance. So if you care about just basic concepts of democracy, put aside whether or not we really are one. We know we're not. We've been striving to become one for hundreds of years. We aren't there yet. This is somebody who looks at the amount of democracy that we have even now and says, yeah, I think it's too much. This in a nation where we don't actually have one man, one vote, one person, one vote, because the Electoral College gives extra weight to certain states. The Senate makeup gives extra weight to smaller states that are highly unrepresentative. And Peter Thiel and JD Vance and Elon Musk and those guys, even that is too democratic. We want basically a national CEO. And if JD Vance becomes president with Peter Thiel and Musk behind him, that's what you're going to have. You're not going to have representative democracy, even in the limited form we have it now. You're going to have this technocracy run by people out of Silicon Valley who think that they know better the way that everyone ought to live and what they ought to do.
Now, Kirsten, I want to come to you in thinking about Tim Walz, because before we had the vice presidential debate, which, very few people watched, right? But before that, we had Tim Walz on the up and JD Vance kind of, pulling the party down. The debate, we saw a real contrast in their styles and what people thought was important, in charisma and the way they kind of responded to the camera. And now we're not seeing that kind of Tim Walz bounce effect that they thought would happen early on. So can you talk a little bit about his framing at this moment? Because we are not seeing a lot of him, and maybe that's intentional.
I am one of those people who was riveted by the VP debate.
I couldn't move. I could not move.
Stuck to my TV screen. We put a lot of investment, unfortunately, as a people in the political theater, right? And I think we had a VP debate, where it was Tim Walz is to win, and by what people look for, charisma and this kind of dancing around and just punching him in the gut and going back and forth. He didn't give that. And we had, JD Vance, who I thought was going to break into kind of Bohemian Rhapsody any moment. I know what was going on, who really charmed people who were not paying attention to what he was saying beneath that. So in the same ways that that kind of disappointment, I think, the expectation that the Coach Walz was about to come out and we were going to see why we were voting for him and all these things that just didn't happen. A lot of excitement around him kind of waned. So I do think that it's not only an indictment of how people put more interest and more investment in the theater, the visuals of what's going on versus the policy versus the man. And he just didn't give people what they wanted that night, unfortunately.
I think I want to try to hit one more question before we go to the break. And I want to pose it to both of you, because I'm looking at the swing states, and we know it's Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Arizona. There is some talk that maybe New Jersey's at play. I'm a little bit concerned about that. But in looking at these 7 swing states, the two that really concern me from the Harris perspective is Georgia. I mean, Georgia has only voted Democratic one time in the last century, and that's when, of course, they went for Biden in 2020, and North Carolina, which has also only voted Democratic one time in the last century, when they went for Barack Obama back in 2008. So can you talk a little bit, Tim, just thinking about the swing states, for what you think is the path forward, and then we'll take a break and reset.
Well, look, I mean, in those states, if everyone who wanted to cast a ballot was able to cast a ballot, then Kamala Harris is going to win those states. And that's true in most all of the swing states. If it's not for voter suppression, if it's not for the ridiculous hoops that people are being made to jump through, particularly in precincts with large numbers of black and brown voters or college students, she's going to win. So what's got to happen is an incredible ground game in those communities. And I believe that they are spending money to do that. But places like Georgia are trying to throw up all kinds of roadblocks. North Carolina as well. We don't know what the effects of the storm are going to be, obviously, on voting. It's had some effect on early voting, apparently, relative to 4 years ago. I think the key is going to be the ground game there. It's going to be very, very close in both places. But I think if the campaign focuses on those communities in metropolitan areas in North Carolina and in Georgia, I believe there's a chance that she can win both of them. But at the margins where that voter suppression makes a difference, you just don't know. And that's why everybody's got to take very seriously their obligation to either vote early, preferably, so there's no question that they've gotten their vote in there, or they've got to get out on election day.
I want to come to you, Kirsten, for the last comment on that, because we're watching. Early voting has started. It starts very soon here in Maryland. My mom called me today. She was so excited. She stood in line. Here's my mom in a wheelchair, my dad on a cane, down in South Carolina, which to me is one of the most racist states. That's my home state. But they're like, we stood there for an hour and they moved us to the front of the line. And my mom was just so happy to be able to cast her ballot. And she's been voting forever. So we have to get people out. Can you talk a little bit about, how do we counter this voter suppression? What else can we do to make sure that people understand that this is more than just making a choice to vote or not to vote, because there's more on the ballot than just Harris and Trump at this moment?
Let me tell you, my 26-year-old nephew, who was out protesting when the state sanctioned killing of Trayvon Martin, went out and voted yesterday. And called and said, for President Cammie is what he called her. I always say it's Kamala. Like he was very excited to go out and vote yesterday. And the ground game in Georgia, you know, in some Kay, I would put my money on Latasha Brown. I would put my money
Yes.
on Cliff Albright. I would put my money on April Albright. The ground game in Georgia is bar none. So I am watching it intensely, but the ground game in Georgia, Black voters matter, what they've done in that state to transform it. Stacey Abrams out in front. I really would. I'm looking to see what Georgia does this time.
Tim, I know you had something you wanted to raise, so let me pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. K. I want to get your take and Kirsten's take on something that I've noticed in this campaign and really in presidential campaigns going back to '08, with the exception maybe of 2020, where racial justice was on the ballot because we were, you know, at that point still in the midst of the post George Floyd uprising. And this thing that I've noticed in most all of those elections, and certainly in this one, is how the Democrats really try, it seems, to avoid any kind of clear messaging around racial justice issues. And I know the argument that people make, right? They worry that if you talk about racism or racial justice, then white folks are going to freak out and it'll push them away. And I've been white a long time. I know that's true for some white folks. But what is interesting about that thinking is that if you actually look at the data, the survey, the research data, you find that the most committed white constituencies for the Democrats, and certainly black voters, who are the most consistent Democratic voters, without whom Democrats win virtually nothing, certainly not at the national level. If you look at what moves them, we just did a study, commissioned a study at the African American Policy Forum, and it found that talking directly about the ongoing fight for racial equity and making clear some of the very specific racial justice stakes in this election actually drives up the percentage of those voters, black voters and white liberal voters, who are highly motivated, increases the number of them who are highly motivated to vote by as much as 17 percentage points on average, which is huge. In other words, it is top of mind for a lot of voters. It is important, and they want candidates and campaigns to talk about it. So why do you think that the party is so afraid to lean into these subjects when the facts on the ground don't seem to suggest that avoidance is a particularly good strategy? Either one of you that wants to go first, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I will start because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think that there is a clear disconnect between those that are running for office and running the party and the voters. If we look at the foundational part of the Democratic Party, it is black women, it is liberal white folks who think about these issues, who show up to campaign, who show up to vote, who show up to protest, who show up when there's a concern happening in the community. And yet every time we do make our voices known, it's almost as if they don't hear us. They don't connect to what we're talking about. We saw it with Clinton, we saw it with Biden, we were concerned under Obama. Like every single president where black folks have shown up, particularly black women, have shown up and voted and supported, there's never been a connection between what we consider to be the most important issues and what they focus on. We have been talking about the lack of racial justice in our community, not since Black Lives Matter. It might have been the time when white folks started talking about it. We've been talking about the lack of racial justice. We can go all the way back and think about the ways in which our community has dealt with racial terror and violence for years, and we still show up to vote with the hope that our issues will be part of the discussion and part of the policies and the plans. And it never seems to happen that way. I do think that one of the strategies that black women did, particularly Win with Black Women, is that they made sure that this time with Joe Biden, that the issues that black women wanted on the agenda actually did happen. They were asking for a few things. They wanted to make sure that we had a black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. That is something that Biden promised that he did. We wanted to make sure a woman was selected as his vice president, not just any woman, not just a white woman. It was a woman of color. He did show up. Now, we asked for reparations. That didn't happen. I have some concerns about that. We got Juneteenth instead, but we asked for a clear mandate around racial justice. And every single time they have fallen short. The conversations are happening below the line. It's why can't we push the people that are running the party? And this includes Barack Obama. It includes Bill Clinton. It includes Joe Biden. And it includes VP Harris, to help them to understand that the issues that we are most concerned about, if they talk about it, if they lean into it, it can get more of us to the polls because we feel that they're hearing us and they're committed to making sure that our issues get passed and get dealt with.
Kirsten, what about you?
Oh, you mean scolding cousin Pookie isn't policy, Tim?
No.
Clearly, clearly not. Clearly not.
We've seen this before. Like Kay said, we saw with the Clintonian kind of third wave policies. We saw with President Obama and his "I'm not the president of Black America, I'm the president of all America" position. Race in this so-called democracy is both erased and amplified as convenient. We saw when folks were looking to blame anyone and anything for Hillary Clinton's electoral college loss, third parties, non-voters, the FBI, Russia, WikiLeaks, anything except whiteness. So, certainly these things have factored into the outcomes, I think, as did voter suppression across the country in the wake of the 2013 Supreme Court decision to gut the Voting Rights Act. But Dems, even then, and as we're seeing now, they continue to seek space to understand and create space for the basket of deplorables that have been let off their leashes across the country. And it did not, and I will argue, would not work long term. When running against Obama, HRC outright said she was the right candidate over Obama because white people are supporting her and a candidate needs white votes to win.
Right.
Well, we saw how that turned out. So maybe I'm naive, Kay, and I think there are more of us than there are of them. That Democrats can loudly create policies that center cash poor people, not just middle class and working class people, but cash poor people, and win. I believe that Democrats can loudly commit to protecting the rights and lands of indigenous people and win. I believe that Democrats can make police officers pay the consequences of their militarized occupation of our communities and win. When Democrats bet on this kind of lukewarm liberalism, a move that's transparent, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, to both the left and the right, they will always, always lose to a white supremacy that never compromises. And we always see white America is supremely uncomfortable facing itself. And the Democratic Party, for better or worse, has been more than happy to kind of coddle that fragility instead of leaning full-throated, whole chest into race-forward policies. The focus has been to skim votes off the top of the right. And like we said, including this theater of bringing out Liz Cheney to talk about Trump when her father's a war criminal. And now, we live in a country, Black, brown, indigenous citizens are targeted, stopped and frisked, raped, gunned down by police officers, and we're still expected to live through more centuries of first steps toward equity, yet we are the ones who discount our votes to some extent. We are the ones who say we're going to vote for you and we're going to wait and you're going to get in power and then you're going to be there to tell us what we need, give us what we need. And like Kay said, we have not seen that happening. We still live in the country of Black Wall Street, still live in the country of the move bombing. Shout out to Mike Africa and the Africa family, still redlining, mass incarceration, school to prison pipelines, all these things are happening. And like you said, many voters want Democratic parties that does not shy away from those issues. So why don't they when the data says they should? And this may be controversial. White supremacy is a party crasher.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that is an important thing to point out because it is it's a long-standing psychology. It's not new. You can go back to the 60s where, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who became a U.S. Senator, he's also UN ambassador, but at that time he was a speechwriter and consultant for LBJ. And he famously said, that the nation ought to indulge this period of benign neglect on race because white folks were tired of hearing about it. They'd been hearing about race all through the 60s and they were tired of it. And then you had in the 70s and 80s a black sociologist, William Julius Wilson, brilliant sociologist, but he made his career arguing that, racism was of declining significance. But even if it's not, we ought to act like it is because the white folks get nervous when you talk about it. And we ought to talk about universal themes and class politics and not race. And that was Clinton's strategy. It was Obama's strategy. And look, in some cases, you could make the argument that short term it worked, right? Clinton won, Obama won. But at what cost? Because when you pretend that racial inequity isn't a problem, two things happen. Number one, you can't solve the problem that you won't name, right? But you also demoralize portions of the party base without whom you cannot win national elections consistently. I mean, running from racism might have helped Obama in the short term, but then we got Trump. So this clearly was not a long-term sustainable strategy. You cannot run away from something that is so central to the national experience. And I learned this back in Louisiana in 1991. First thing I did out of college, first job I had in this world, in this work, was doing work against David Duke when he ran for the U.S. Senate in 90 and governor in 91. I was the associate director of the largest organization formed for the purpose of defeating him, which was a PAC called the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. And in the first race, the Senate race, in 1990, we had these mainstream Democratic consultants, and I'm going to name them and shame them, and everybody ought to know who they are. It's Mark Penn and Doug Schoen. Of course it is. Google them. You'll understand why they did what they did. They told us not to talk about Duke being a racist, not to talk about Duke selling pro-Hitler books from his state legislative office, because white folks wouldn't care about that, or they might even like it. They said, y'all ought to really talk about the fact that David dodged the draft in Vietnam. Y'all ought to talk about the fact that Duke paid his taxes late. And we thought that was ridiculous, but our board was sort of intimidated by these consultants. They're like, oh man, we better do that. So we had a compromise where we run these ads, and half of the ad talked about Duke being a Nazi, and the other half talked about him paying his taxes late. And that was totally confusing to voters, right? Because what it does is it normalized David Duke. You treat him like a regular politician, because a regular politician, you might talk about the tax thing. You might talk about the draft, even though I would say dodging the Vietnam draft, probably the best thing David Duke ever did, right? But you might do that with a normal candidate, but you don't do that with a Nazi. If he's a Nazi, you stick on Nazi, right? Because that's sort of a big one. And when you don't do that, what happened is black folks heard it and they're like, how dangerous is he if y'all got time to talk about taxes in Vietnam, right? White liberals and progressives, I remember, were like, how bad can it be if you're talking about that? So in the governor's race, we changed tactics, right? We ditched those consultants. We stopped talking about this secondary nonsense that normalized Duke, stayed focused on the extremism and the threat that he posed to the values that people hold dear. And what happened? Yeah, David still got the majority of the white vote. Don't get me wrong. He had 60% in the Senate race, still had 55 in the governor's race. But you know what happened? Black turnout went through the roof. It went from the high 60% or around 70% up to about 80%. That made the difference because it mobilized the base. And that is what works in races like this, which is why leaning into that argument, talking about the threats to racial justice and democracy itself, is a way that you treat Donald Trump like not a normal person. He's not a normal candidate. It's not Mitt Romney, right? It's not even Ronald Reagan. He actually is a whole different breed of cat. And in this particular instance, we could learn a lot from what we learned in Louisiana over 35 years ago now.
Yeah, I do want to name here one thing around Black maternal morbidity and VP Harris. I think when we talk about race forward policies, the importance of speaking about Black women and fourth trimester and the cellular aging that we experienced that leads to kind of these race that we have is an important thing for her to focus on, and she has, to her credit, focused on that. Yeah. But I also do want to name that there's a cumulative impact of, like you said, focusing on their own campaigns and how that impacts future elections, and then they don't hold responsibility of that. For instance, it may have worked short term for Obama, but now we're in a position where Black people are like, so what are we going to get now? We put ourselves on hold for this election. We put ourselves on hold here. We're putting ourselves on hold here. What are we going to get now? And instead of framing that as, hey, this is years and years of being demoralized, years and years of being ignored, years and years of saying, vote for me and I got you, years of kissing Black babies in churches and not getting much in return for it, years of this. And then when we come to an election, it's framed like, well, you supported me. Why aren't you supporting this person? Well, people are tired. So I think that's also unfortunate that people aren't looking at the holistic picture of it's not necessarily why aren't people showing out this time, is what has happened for elections across the span of democracy that made people tired of showing up time and time again.
Well, I add to that, and I thank you both for that, is I think about the fact that people don't take into account how important voting is for the Black community. I mean, ever since the end of American slavery, Black men showed up, even with threats of violence and bodily harm, they showed up to vote. And they saw the differences that were made in southern cities, from putting in mayors, from putting in sheriffs. Like, Black men showed up to vote. Even when we are in the midst of a racial syndemic, this idea that we have all these factors happening at one time, we still go to the polls. I think about what was happening with Biden. We were dealing with Black Lives Matter, which was still an issue. You come out of the state-sanctioned violence and killing of George Floyd. You look at all the videos that were happening. You think about the fact that we were in the midst of COVID-19 that was disproportionately impacting Black women. We were catching it. Black men were disproportionately dying from it. And we were dealing with Trump. And we still went to the polls. We still stood in line because we have this central belief that if our vote gets through, then change will happen, even though that's not necessarily the exchange that happens. Our vote gets through, but the people we put into office don't necessarily answer to what we need. I think what Kirsten said, is very important. This notion that we did it for every single Democratic candidate all the way through. And we keep waiting for what is ours. This is what I love about Gen Z. They are no longer waiting. My mom waited. That's the first affirmative action generation that we used to call the boomers. I'm Gen X, the greatest generation. We waited. The millennials are being taught to wait. My sons are Gen Z, and they're like, enough of the waiting. It doesn't matter to me whether the candidate is black, doesn't matter whether they're white. Who is meeting our needs? And I think if you take it to that base level, it does change this kind of commitment goal, the sustained goal of, we can always count on the black vote. No, you actually now have to go out and earn the black vote and not just assume it's going to show up. And if you're not talking about racial justice for a lot of Gen Zers, and you're not talking their language at all.
Yeah, I think about this. Voting in my family, my grandfather was the first black alderman in Natchez, Mississippi post-Reconstruction. My father was an alderman for 20 plus years. My other grandfather was an alderman for 20 plus years. When my grandfather passed, my grandmother took his place as the first black woman alderwoman in that county, in that city. And they paid their poll taxes. He paid her poll taxes so she could vote, right? The Mississippi Sovereignty Commission has reports on my family because they were involved in such, nefarious organizations as the NAACP, fighting for freedom for black people. So when I think of them, I don't think about my vote being beholden to the Democratic Party. I think about my vote being my voice because I know what they fought for. They wanted me to have a voice. And that's what we are saying with Gen Z. That's what we are saying across racial, across gender, across, different political demographics in this age group, that they're not waiting anymore, like you said. They're refusing to wait. And I'm just really happy to see it. And I think about James Baldwin, the first time I thought about time as a racist construct, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, you wasted my mother's time, my father's time, my brother's time, my sister's time, my uncle and my aunt's time. How much time do you want for your progress? And that's where we are now.
We are at what I call the final lap. I like to use running analogies, Kirsten, because that's something that's important to me. But I always think that when you get out and you run, like you run that first section, you run it with your energy and your enthusiasm, which if you think about when VP Harris got the baton, we had all this excitement. It's all about running with joy, all about staying with us. But that second half is you run it with muscle memory. It's like, okay, we know how to do this. You saw what kicked in Georgia. You saw what kicked in North Carolina. You saw black folks working the polls like we do. We know how to do this. But we're at what they call that final 6.1 or so miles in that marathon where you have to run this part with your heart. At this point, it's like, what full sort of America do I want to live in, and which candidate will speak to that? I want to pass it to you to just put something on the table, because I know you've been thinking a lot about this, and then I want to come back and have us to think clearly about what does it mean to vote down the line, because I want to make sure that people understand that it's not just about putting in Harris or Trump. If they don't have the House, if they don't have the Senate, we can either block things from happening or we can support things going forward. So I'll go first to you, Kirsten.
Thank you for that, Kaye. Yeah, I talked a little bit at the top of the hour about why I think joy has not been so much front and center, because how can it be? There's a lot going on in the world that is not joyful. So I do think there may have been an intentional shift in mood, considering all that's going on. But right now, I want to talk about black men. I want to talk about black men. So I'm going to share with you guys a message I received some years ago. And it says, "You're over there wishing your skin was pink, freckled, and waiting for melanoma. I take solace in the fact that no one hates you nearly as much as you hate yourself. You're not going anywhere anytime soon because there's always a place for the Negro bed wench to do her undermining and self-sabotage, at least until she's no longer needed." Now, a black man sent me that, and you would have thought that I had just written the most horrific thing, but no. I was writing about the importance of reproductive justice, specifically access to safe, legal, and destigmatized abortion. And what I've seen over the years, when I write about police and state violence, these are the kind of men who call me queen. When I'm writing about sexual violence and harassment, they call me witch with the B, right? I've said for many years that the diversification of white supremacy is necessary for its survival. Dangerous, violently ignorant white supremacist ideologies in blackface do not get a pass. Misogynoir does not get a pass. It is a real and present interpersonal and structural threat that cannot be ignored, and VP Harris is experiencing it on unprecedented levels, full stop. And the fullness of black manhood cannot be reduced to that, nor can we allow that to become the prevailing narrative, right? So in 2015, the New York Times study led with a sobering headline, 1.5 million missing black men, and included such findings as this. Of the 1.5 million missing black men from 25 to 54, which researchers call the prime age years, higher imprisonment rates account for almost 600,000. Almost 1 in 12 black men in this age group are behind bars. Now, this massive kind of incarceration compounded by substandard health care and fragile mortality rates, in fact, this leapt from the study. More than 1 out of every 6 black men who today should be between 25 and 54 years old have disappeared from daily life. Now, y'all, I never forgot that study, because what I knew then and what I know now is that many of them are not missing. They haven't disappeared, right? They've been stolen. They've been ripped from their families to feed prison cells. They're regurgitated back into society, more than likely unable to vote or find a job that enables them to care for their families. There's a direct line, obviously, from slavery to the prison industrial complex. And so I'm looking at, with all of this, black men have a right, I believe, to say, what about us in policy conversations? Not us grouped in with everyone else, but what about us? I'm old enough to remember the criticism levied against 200 black men who came together to encourage President Obama to include black women and girls in his My Brother's Keeper initiative. I see the work being done by, Kendrick Sampson and Bill Power to protect democracy and support black women. I see the work done by Phil Agnew and Black Men Build to protect democracy and support black women. The day after Win with Black Women had their historic win with 1.5 million raised in 3 hours to support VP Harris, I saw Roland Martin organizing Black Men for Harris on his Black Star Network with Dakari Sellers and Khalil Thompson, and more than 50,000 black men raised 1.3 million. I mentioned my nephew voting. So while it is true that there are some sexist black men, right? There's some black men who traffic in misogynoir, some black men who don't want to see a black woman in power. That is not the project masculinity reserved for black men, nor is it an accurate portrayal of black male voting bloc as a whole, and it's certainly not an accurate portrayal of black men as a whole. And as I watched President Obama the other day, talking about feeling some kind of way following Eminem at the Detroit rally, then rapping the lyrics to Lose Yourself, including the lyric about looking calm and ready on the surface to drop bombs. Certainly a choice in this moment. I became even more convinced that there's a disconnect there, Kaye. There's a disconnect, Tim. My suggestion to President Obama et al. Would be to stop talking down to Cousin Pookie, right? Who is probably a present father, as most black fathers are, as data and my own lived experience show me, who is likely going to work more and getting paid far less than his white counterparts, but not before being stopped on his way to work by police, and treat him with some respect. In AAPF's research in battleground states, 80% of black men totally motivated to vote. 76% of black men are voting for VP Harris. Black men are concerned about Project 25. They are concerned about, as Malcolm said, enemies teaching our children and attempting to bury the truths about slavery. James Baldwin again said, I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. So be clear, 81% of black men voted for Hillary Clinton despite all the criticisms levied against her, but 47% of white women voted for Donald Trump. You do the math. So I want to turn it over to you all and say, do you think this kind of preemptive scapegoating of black men is going to prove effective? Because I don't understand why it continues to happen.
Well, I think whether it's going to be effective or not, is going to depend on how the media frames it. It's going to depend on how the campaign responds to that framing. The media has done a number, and when I say frame black men, I mean that both literally and metaphorically, right? Framing them as the reason why she might lose. Now, as you said, if 81% of black men voted for Clinton, let's even say that there's slippage since then, and let's say it goes 75-25 for Kamala Harris. I'm sorry, if you win a demographic 3-1, that's a blowout. You can't blame that demographic for not being 4-1 or 5-1. 3-1 is not why you lost. If you lose, it will be because, if Kamala Harris loses, it will be because white men, even more than before, voted for Donald Trump. including a lot of young Gen Z white men who are now moving in very large numbers over to his camp because of all this bro whispering they're doing on sports podcasts and crypto sites and this nonsense. Or it's going to be because white women, once again, went to the polls and either split or broke slightly for Donald Trump. So this happened in California. Remember around Prop 8, marriage equality. When marriage equality, is before the Obergefell decision, when marriage equality was on the ballot in California and failed, right, and black folks voted against marriage equality, as did white folks, they blamed black folks. There was an exit poll that said, oh, it's because black people were opposed to it. Turned out that exit poll was like in one precinct. It involved like 237 people. And they decided that was why. Now, black folks are what, like 6, 7, 8% of the electorate in the state of California? How are you going to blame that group? Well, because it's easier than looking at the real problem, right? And so I hope it's not going to work. And I hope that we can recognize two things can be true at once. As you said, Kirsten, there can be, yes, of course. Look, misogyny is a thing. Patriarchy is a thing. Sexism is a thing. But it wasn't created by black men. You know, money may not trickle down. I said this last week in the conversation with Kevin Powell. Money may not trickle down. Tax cuts may not trickle down. But things like racism and misogyny and classism and those things, they do. And so if the dominant culture creates those things, don't be surprised that some people in non-dominant cultural groups are also going to adopt them. The question is, are we going to deal with the root of that problem? Or are we just going to blame folks that fell for the trap?
I want to note one thing, just in terms of what Tim has mentioned. One of the things that is a thing, scapegoating black men is a thing. Black men are taught that you don't support your families, and all the data and research shows something different. That black men don't show up to vote. All the data and the research shows something different. That black men don't go to college. All the data and research shows something different. That black men can swing this election for or against Kamala Harris, that they are a movable entity. I mean, black men only make up 5.7% of the men in this country. So if Kamala Harris does not win, it's not because black men chose to exercise their very full right to decide which candidate best meets their needs. It's almost as if, in the ways in which President Barack Obama shows up to scold black men, and let's be very clear, I'm one of the few people, I believe that has been a strategy of his that's long-term. He's been scolding black men and black people for a very long time. He shows up, he beats us down. Even when we were growing up, our grandfather would beat us and tell us they love us afterwards. We don't get that from Barack Obama. He shows up and tells us everything that's wrong with us, but he gets past us to the white community, which is a different conversation, but it's a conversation I do think we need to have.
Let's have it, Kaye.
Yeah, we need to have it because that is really a concern with me. So when he talks about Pookie, the problem is when you insult Pookie, Dr. Malcolm hears it and Martin Esquire hears it. Black men across the board are saying, you know what, you're not just going to scapegoat Pookie. You're talking about all black men, as if we're unable to think for ourselves, make decisions for ourselves, or put our needs on the table. Black men are being set up to be the scapegoat. I think back to the Million Man March, when black men showed up and said, look, we are here for our families. We are here for our wives, for our sisters, for our children. We're here to think about what do we need to do to save our community. Those are the black men, and not just the ones I know anecdotally, like my dad and my brother and my husband and my sons. It's across the board, looking at black men who are struggling to keep their head above the water. And every time something happens in this country, whether it's Reaganomics, whether it's the mass industrial prison complex, whether it's unemployment rates, whether it's the billion-dollar cannabis industry that still has black men who can't get these felony records removed from selling marijuana on the street. Like, this is the reality of what it means to be a black man in America. And to simply keep pushing the narrative that black men can't seem to make up their mind, that black men are supporting Trump, and that's the reason that Kamala Harris might be flailing right now, I think that is a false narrative. It's a lie. And what they're setting up to do is they're setting up a whole structure to excuse whiteness, to excuse white supremacy, to excuse white women, and instead blame black men. And I think anyone who is concerned about the constant blaming of black men that has been in this country since 1619 and continues today should push back against it. Every time I bring this up on my radio show, black men reach out and say, thank you. We are not trying to destroy the country. We're just trying to keep our heads above water. And being told that we can't make up our minds, being told that it's just about misogyny and misogynoir, doesn't take into account all the work that other black men are doing to get black men to the polls. I think something that Kirsten said earlier, what about me, is a real thing to ask. I mean, I'm starting to ask that question as a black woman. I'm like, okay, so now what about me? What are you doing that's actually going to help my community? Yes, I'm excited about having a black woman on the Supreme Court. I'm excited about that. I'm excited about having more judges and justices who are black women. I'm very excited about that. But how does that trickle down into helping black children get a better education? How does it trickle down to changing poverty rates? How does it trickle down to make sure that they're not burdened by student loan debt? Like, how does it trickle down? Because there's some issues that Dr. King said. He said, when we move beyond race, the real question this country has to address is the question of class. And whether or not those who are in control, running the party, who are millionaires plus now, do they really understand the fight that a number of black men are having just to financially keep their heads above water and try to keep their feet on the ground?
Yes, ma'am.
So I want to, with that in mind, I think this is a good time, and Kirsten, I'll come to you, because I'm trying to make sure people understand, and this is something that I argue about on my show, so I want to be very clear. I say that what the Republican Party has done a very good job of, they have trained their voters to vote down the line. I mean, it's a pig in lipstick. If it's a Republican, it doesn't matter. They will show up and go, what? I'm going to vote for the pig because I'm never going to give that particular position over to a Democrat. It's in blue states that you can have a Republican governor. You never see that in a red state. I speak as someone from Maryland where we voted for a Republican twice, who still has some of the highest approval ratings and who's running now as a senator against a woman. And black folks are saying, well, he's been a good governor. I'm like, no, but he's going down to Washington. He will be a Republican when he steps foot in Washington, D.C. Republican voters vote down the line. They fall in line. Democratic voters fall in love. It's like, can I have a beer with the person? Do I like them? I'll show up if I like them. I won't if I don't. That's a problem. How do we help people to understand that if we really want to achieve any modicum of real political success, it's voting all the way down the line, and not just for the presidential candidates. So I want to have you speak a little bit about that, Kirsten, and then I'll come to you, Tim.
Well, I think the blue no matter who contention is a real thing, but being from Mississippi, I also see where you could have majority black populaces and a Republican person in place, or a Dixiecrat. I'm of the age where we see a lot of Dixiecrats as well. I don't know if I would necessarily speak. I'm a proponent of voting down all the elections, all the local elections. Again, I have a father who stayed in local politics because he said you can actually see what is happening. You can see the changes in what's being implemented in your communities in real time. I would shift the onus to politicians, though. I would shift that to them. I would give people something to vote for. We talked about this kind of lukewarm liberalism, this shift to the right, this centrism that we see where people are willing to negotiate with white supremacy in a way that whiteness is never willing to negotiate with freedom and justice and liberation. So when you give someone something in the middle and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's looking a little similar with the lights down, I'm not really sure, it's kind of hard to tell people to just vote blue no matter who. It really, really is. So I would shift, again, the onus to people in running for office, give people a clear message of something to vote for that differentiates you from the person that you're running against. Because this kind of move to skim votes off the top of white supremacy is just not going to work.
And so, Tim, I'll come to you for your final comments about that, just trying to push people to see this as a big picture.
I definitely agree with Kirsten, but I think we are in this sort of defensive posture right now. And there's a very good chance that Donald Trump is going to win. And if that happens, it is going to be absolutely crucial that the House, at the very least, is not in the hands of the Republicans, because that's where legislation is going to originate. That is where appropriations are going to originate. All those folks that are all hyped about the stimulus check they got from Donald Trump, didn't get a stimulus check from Donald Trump because Donald Trump doesn't have the power to appropriate money. The Congress has the power to appropriate money. Donald Trump just insisted on signing the check because he understands the psychological impact of that. And I promise you, if the Republicans were in charge of Congress when that decision was made, that stimulus may very well not have happened, or it would have been considerably less. So it absolutely matters. The Senate is going to be tough this year. In 2 years, a little bit more favorable to the Democrats. But it is important to remind folks that at the very least, you got to have a plan B in case this man wins. In general, I agree. You got to give people a reason to vote for him. That's a pretty good one right now, though, in 2024.
Agreed.
I appreciate, but I like that. Have a plan B. And as I try to tell people, plan B is not necessarily I have to move. I'm like, not everybody can actually pack up and leave the country, although there are people talking about that like it's a real thing. I think we have to kind of get into that in our future conversations, because is that really a plan B? That I'm just going to leave the country?
Is real.
It really is real, except that when we do, if that's going to be the plan, then who actually has the ability to leave? Those who have money, those who have a passport, those who have access. You mentioned Pookie. I'm not sure Pookie's going to be like, you know what, let's move where? Like when, how, and with what resources. But we have a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
I like what Kirsten said.
My family's blood is in Mississippi is sacred ground for me. My family's blood is there. They're going to have to run me out of this country.
Come on. That's how I feel about South Carolina, racist as it is. I'm like, that's where my family cemetery is, and I'm sorry. This is the ground I'm going to have to fight for. Folks, we're going to leave it here for today. Thank you for listening, and remember to chime in on social media. You can leave your thoughts on the African American Policy Forum's YouTube channel, reach out to any of us on Twitter, or give us a call and tell us what's on your mind. We will be back later with another conversation as we move closer to Election Day. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much, Kirsten. And thank you to the African American Policy Forum. I'm Dr. Kaye from Today with Dr. Kaye on WEAA.